The letter was already sealed when my daughter-in-law walked into the kitchen that morning. I set my coffee down, watched her open the refrigerator, move things around, close it again without taking anything. She did that sometimes. Just checked, like she was taking inventory of what was hers. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my coffee and went back to the porch. That was 3 weeks before everything fell apart. My name is Eugene. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio, and when I retired, I had one plan: fix up the old house my father left me, grow tomatoes in the backyard, and read every book I'd set aside during the years I was too busy grading papers to sit down properly. My wife, Louise, passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. It was fast, the way those things sometimes are. One spring, she was fine. By October, she was gone. After that, the house got very quiet. My son Kevin was 34 when this started. He worked in logistics, managing warehouse operations for a distribution company out of Columbus. His wife, my daughter-in-law Renee, was a dental hygienist, or had been until she decided she preferred not to work anymore. That was her phrase. Preferred not to. They'd been renting an apartment in Columbus for 4 years. Then the rent went up, the lease ended, and Kevin called me on a Sunday afternoon. "Dad, we're in a tough spot." I told him to come home. That's the thing about being a father. You don't calculate, you just say yes. They moved in on a Saturday in April. Kevin carried boxes. Renee walked through each room with her arms crossed and her eyes moving slowly across the walls, the furniture, the shelves where Louise's things still sat. She didn't say much that first day. She was just looking. I gave them the guest room, which was large enough, had its own bathroom, and got good morning light. I thought it would be temporary. 6 months, maybe. Long enough for them to save, find a place, get back on their feet. That was 18 months before the police came to my door. The first few months were fine. Kevin helped me fix the gutters. We ate dinner together 3 or 4 nights a week. Renee kept to herself mostly, which I didn't mind. I respected her space. I assumed she respected mine. I should have paid attention earlier to the small things. She rearranged the living room without asking. I came downstairs one morning in the armchair where I read. Louise's chair, actually, the one she'd picked out at an estate sale in 1998, had been moved to the far corner, almost behind the bookcase. When I asked about it, Renee said it opened up the room. I moved the chair back. She mentioned once that my father's old roll-top desk in the study was taking up a lot of real estate. I told her it wasn't going anywhere. She mentioned, twice, that the master bedroom had a better layout for 2 people. I slept in the master bedroom. I had slept there for 22 years. Kevin never said anything directly. He had this way of being present without taking a position. He would nod when Renee spoke and look at the wall when I did. I used to wonder, watching him, where the boy went who used to argue with me about everything, who had opinions sharp enough to cut. It smoothed himself down into something agreeable, and I didn't know when that had happened. 8 months after they moved in, Renee's parents drove down from Indianapolis. Her father's name was Douglas. Her mother was Patricia. They arrived in a silver SUV with 2 suitcases and the energy of people who had already decided something. Douglas walked through my living room with his hands in his pockets, nodding slowly the way people do at open houses. Patricia asked where the laundry room was. They were only supposed to stay for a long weekend. The weekend ended. They were still there. I said nothing the first week. I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. The second week, I asked Kevin what was happening. He took a long time to answer. "They're between places right now, Dad. It's just temporary." "How temporary?" "A few weeks." I looked at him for a moment. He looked at the wall. Douglas and Patricia took the guest room. Kevin and Renee moved their things into the study, which they'd been using as an overflow closet. That left Douglas sleeping 8 feet from my kitchen, and Patricia using the whole bathroom that I used every morning. It was my house. I had paid it off in 2019. My name was on the deed. Louise and I had replaced the roof, the furnace, the windows. We had planted the oak tree in the backyard that was now 30 feet tall. None of that seemed to matter anymore. Renee started making comments about the master bedroom again. Casual, offhand. The way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. Douglas has a bad back. The mattress in the guest room isn't great for him. I said I was sorry to hear that. The master has that adjustable base you never use. I said Louise had used it. She got quiet in a particular way. The way that meant she was storing it. 3 days later at dinner, Douglas mentioned that the master bedroom was really the more practical option for him and Patricia given his medical situation. He said it like it was a logistical problem with an obvious solution. Like I just hadn't thought of it yet. I put my fork down. I looked at him across the table that my grandfather had built in 1962. I said, "This is my home. That is my room. I've slept in it for over 20 years, and I'm not moving out of it." Douglas looked at Renee. Renee looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at the wall. That night, I heard them talking. Not the words, just the shape of it. Low and continuous, the sound of people building a case. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, Kevin came to me while I was drinking coffee on the porch. He sat down in the other chair. He looked tired. "Dad," he said, "I know this is hard. It isn't hard. I'm just not doing it. They're older. Douglas has real health issues. Then Douglas should sleep in a hospital bed, not my bedroom." Kevin rubbed his face. "Can't you just be flexible? It's not forever." I looked at my son. He was wearing a look I recognized. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision and was just asking for permission to have made it. "Kevin," I said, "I have been flexible. I let you move in when you needed it. I didn't charge you rent. I've cooked meals and stayed out of your way and given you more grace than you know. That's the flexibility I had. I don't have more." He went inside. I sat on the porch for a long time. The oak tree moved a little in the wind. A cardinal landed on the fence and left. I was already thinking, there's a man named Howard Bledsoe who used to coach JV basketball at the school where I taught. He retired the same year I did, and he'd spent the years since becoming what he called genuinely competent at things I should have learned 30 years ago. One of those things was estate law. He'd taken courses. He had opinions about trusts. I'd always half listened. I called him that afternoon. "Howard," I said, "I need to talk to someone." He didn't ask questions over the phone. He told me to come over. I sat in his kitchen for 2 hours. I told him everything. He listened the way good listeners do, without offering solutions until you were done, without making you feel dramatic. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Eugene," he said, "the problem isn't that your family is behaving badly. Plenty of families behaving badly. Plenty of families behave badly, and it works itself out. The problem is they're doing it in your house. Once people start treating someone else's property like their own, the psychology shifts. It gets harder, not easier." He told me to call his attorney, a woman named Gail Torrance who practiced in Dayton and specialized in elder law and estate planning. I called her the next morning. What I learned in that first conversation changed everything. I learned that because Kevin and Renee had been living in my home for 18 months, removing them was not simply a matter of asking them to leave. Ohio law required formal notice, a written document, a waiting period. Even for family, even in a home they didn't own. I learned that Douglas and Patricia, who had been there for nearly 2 months, were in a similar category. They were licensees. Removing them required process. I learned what elder abuse actually meant under Ohio law. Not just physical harm, but financial exploitation, isolation, and a pattern of conduct designed to pressure an older adult to relinquish property or assets. I left Gail's office with a folder of papers and a clearer picture of what was happening in my house than I'd had in months. I also left with a plan. Here is what I didn't do. I didn't go home and confront anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my behavior at all, except in one way. I started paying attention, carefully, systematically, the way I used to pay attention in 31 years of watching teenagers. I noticed that Renee had begun redirecting my mail, not dramatically, just slipping certain envelopes under her bedroom door. I found this out when my financial advisor called to confirm I'd received a statement and I hadn't. I noticed that Douglas had started answering the front door when I was home, greeting neighbors, introducing himself. I noticed that Kevin had begun asking questions about the house's market value, casually, like he was curious. I noticed that Renee had removed Louise's photographs from the living room bookshelf and replaced them with a succulent arrangement. She didn't ask. I found Louise's photos in a box in the hall closet. I replaced them that evening. I didn't say a word about it. I called Gail the next day. She asked me if I'd experienced any pressure to add names to the property deed or change my will. I told her about the conversations regarding the master bedroom, Douglas's back, the incremental way the house had been reframed as a shared space. She typed while I talked. "We're going to want to document this," she said. "Dates, specific statements. Keep a notebook." I bought a composition notebook at Walgreens that afternoon. I wrote down everything I remembered. Dates, phrases, who was present. I kept it in the drawer of Louise's nightstand, which I'd always kept locked. The weeks that followed were strange. I was living in a house with 4 people who thought they were winning something, while I quietly prepared for what was coming. The confrontation I hadn't planned for came on a Thursday evening in November. I had made dinner, pot roast, which took most of the afternoon, because I find it calming. We were eating together, the 5 of us, when Douglas cleared his throat and said he and Patricia had been thinking. He said it would make more sense logistically for Kevin and Renee to have the master bedroom and for him and Patricia to take the study. Given his back, given the layout, given that it was going to be their house eventually anyway. I put my fork down. That last part had never been said out loud before. I looked at Kevin. He was looking at his plate. "Kevin," I said, "is that what you think? That this is going to be your house?" He looked up. He looked tired and something else, ashamed maybe, or caught. "Dad, I just mean, eventually, yeah. When I'm dead." He didn't answer. "I'm 67 years old," I said. "I'm healthy. I walk 3 miles every morning. I plan to be sitting at this table for a long time yet." Renee's jaw was tight. Nobody said anything about, "Your father said, eventually it'll be their house. That has a meaning." I looked at all of them. "You moved into my home because I wanted to help you. You have not paid rent. You have not paid utilities. In 18 months, I've spent roughly $14,000 housing and feeding 6 people, including 2 who arrived uninvited." I paused. "I have been patient. I have been generous. And I have watched that generosity be mistaken for weakness." Renee started to say something. I raised my hand, not aggressively, just stop. "I'm not finished," I said. "I want to be clear with all of you. This is my house. It will remain my house until I am gone. And what happens to it then is my decision alone. That decision is currently being revised." The table was very quiet. Douglas looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at his plate. Patricia looked at her hands. Renee looked at me. "What does that mean, revised?" "It means what it sounds like." I finished my dinner. I cleared my plate. I went to the porch. That night, I called Gail and told her it was time. The formal notices went out 2 days later, hand-delivered by a process server, a man named Eddie who had the calm, professional manner of someone who did this regularly and held no personal feelings about it. Kevin and Renee received notice that they had 30 days to vacate the premises. Douglas and Patricia received the same. I was standing in the kitchen when Kevin came downstairs with the papers in his hand. His face had a look I hadn't seen since he was 16, and I told him his car privileges were suspended. "Dad, what is this?" "It's a legal notice. It means what it says. You're evicting me. I'm your son. You're my son and I love you. You're also an adult who has lived in my home for a year and a half without financial contribution, who invited your in-laws to move in without my consent, and who sat at my table while those same in-laws suggested I give up my bedroom and forfeit my home." I looked at him steadily. "The notice is not negotiable." Renee appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the paper in Kevin's hand. Her face shifted through several expressions very quickly. "You can't do this," she said. "We've been here. This is our home." "No," I said. "It's mine." She said several other things. I listened to them the way you listen to rain, aware of it, not moved by it. Douglas came out of the guest room. He had a look of a man trying to locate his authority. "Now, see here, Eugene, I said, and I'd ask you to read your own notice." He looked at it. His face went the color of old chalk. What happened over the following 2 weeks was, to put it plainly, unpleasant. There were arguments, there were phone calls at late hours. Renee's sister called me twice to say I was destroying the family. A neighbor stopped me in the driveway to say a young woman had been asking her questions about me, whether I was in my right mind, whether I seemed confused lately. I wrote that down in my notebook and called Gail. Gail had already filed a protective order application based on my documentation. The pattern of conduct, the mail interference, the pressure campaign regarding the bedroom, the questions to neighbors, the financial isolation, constituted elder abuse under Ohio statute. It wasn't just my opinion. It was a legal finding. 2 officers came to the house on a Tuesday morning. Officers Reyes and Sutton, both professional, both matter-of-fact, both very clear with Renee about what the protective order meant and what would happen if it was violated. Douglas didn't say anything to anyone. He and Patricia packed their car that afternoon and drove back to Indianapolis. I stood on the porch and watched the silver SUV back out of my driveway. Kevin left 4 days later. He didn't take everything in one trip. He came back twice over the next week, each time quieter than the last. The last time, he stood in the entryway with a box of his mother's old holiday dishes that he'd taken from the hall closet months ago and put, I assume, in his room. He looked at me. "I didn't mean for it to go this way," he said. I thought about Louise. I thought about the early mornings when Kevin was small and would come downstairs before anyone else and sit on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, just to be near someone. I thought about the person he had been and the person he had let himself become, and how those two things are not always the same person, and how that is one of the real griefs of being a parent. "I know," I said. He left. The house was quiet in a different way after that, not the empty quiet after Louise died, which had a kind of ringing to it, like silence after a sound. This was just settled, like the house remembering what it was. I walked through each room. I put Louise's photographs back on the bookshelf where they belonged. I moved my armchair back from the corner. I made coffee and sat on the porch and watched the cardinal come back to the fence, which it does most mornings if you're patient enough to wait. There are things I need to tell you that I didn't handle with a shrug. I spent 7 weeks with an attorney modifying my estate plan. The house is now held in a revocable living trust. My beneficiaries have changed. A portion of my estate will go to the Dayton Literacy Coalition. Louise volunteered there for 11 years. A portion will go to my nephew Paul, who lives in Nashville and has never once asked me what my house is worth. I kept Kevin in the will reduced. Not as punishment, I want to be honest about that. He is still my son, but the unconditional inheritance he had assumed was his is now conditional on a trust document that Gail structured with language I won't go into here. What it means practically is this: greed has consequences, and paperwork can make those consequences very durable. The financial reality is this: in 18 months, I absorbed approximately $14,000 in household expenses for people who contributed nothing. The legal fees for the protective order and trust restructuring cost me $6,000. That's $20,000 to learn what I should have set as terms on day one. I don't say this as a complaint. I say it because if you are an older adult and someone is about to move into your home, please put the terms in writing before they arrive. Kevin called me in January. He and Renee had rented an apartment in Westerville. He asked if we could have dinner sometime. I said yes, I'd think about when. I am thinking about when. Some mornings, I make a full pot of coffee and drink it alone on the porch. And I feel something that I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a man who is in his own home, on his own schedule, accountable to no one, at peace. I am 67 years old. If my father's health is any measure, I have another 20 years in this house. That is a long time to live well. I intend to use all of it. I've thought a lot about what made everything unravel the way it did. Not just for Renee and Kevin, but for Douglas and Patricia too. And the honest answer is that it wasn't one thing. It never is. It was a long series of small choices that each seemed minor enough on their own, but stacked up into something they couldn't walk back from. Renee moved Louise's photographs off that shelf. That was a choice. Douglas walked through my living room like he was pricing it. That was a choice. Kevin sat at my table and looked at the wall instead of at me. That was a choice too. Maybe the one that cost him the most in the end. I'm not a man who believes the universe keeps score. I don't think there's some ledger somewhere tallying wrongs and rights and paying them out at interest. What I do believe, what 31 years of watching young people grow and stall and grow again taught me, is that your choices build the person you become, and the person you become is what you have to live with. Renee became someone who moved a grieving man's photographs into a box in a closet. She'll have to carry that. Not because I'll punish her for it, but because that's who she showed herself to be, and people who do things like that generally know it, somewhere underneath all the justifications. Kevin became someone who looked at the wall. That one I understand more, honestly. It's easier to go quiet than to stand between the person you love and the person who raised you. I understand the pull of it, but understanding something doesn't make it free of consequence. He lost a year and a half of building something real, spent it instead building resentment in someone else's house, and walked away with less than he came with. That's not punishment, that's arithmetic. What I want people to take from this, if anything, is something simpler than a lesson. It's just this: know what you own. Not in the legal sense, though. That matters, and you should have the paperwork. I mean, know what you have built, what you have earned, what belongs to you by virtue of the years you put into it, and then defend it. Not aggressively, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who has nothing to prove. I spent too long accommodating people who mistook my patience for surrender. The moment I stopped explaining myself and started acting, calling Gail, keeping the notebook, filing the paperwork, everything became clear. Not easy. Clear. There's a difference. I also want to say something about intelligence because I think it gets misunderstood. People think being smart means arguing better, winning the room, having the sharper comeback. It doesn't. Being smart in situations like mine meant paying attention, writing things down, knowing what elder abuse actually looked like under Ohio law before anyone had used the word. It meant not tipping my hand at the dinner table when I already knew what I was going to do. Intelligence in a hard situation is mostly patience applied with precision. And the resolve. That came from Louise, honestly. From sitting with her absence long enough to understand what it cost her to build what we built. You don't let that go because someone finds it inconvenient. You hold it. Kevin called me in January. We're having dinner next month. I don't know what that becomes, but I know who I am walking into that dinner, and I know what I'm walking back to after. My house, my chair, my photographs on the shelf. That's enough.